I'm pleased that we have as our guest tonight, Marti Schmidt. She's National Lawyers Guild and has a long career as an equal employment lawyer, labor organizing law, and other areas of progressive law too numerous to count and go into. And she is going to speak to us tonight on what is the international view of the U.S. Healthcare in terms of denying human rights.
My title is Holding the U.S. Internationally Accountable for Abusing the Human Right to Health. So what I'm going to be talking about is international accountability. So, I guess people might have some questions about what that is, why do it. But the first question, what am I talking about? International accountability, it seems rather huge. Basically, what I'm going to be talking about is the involvement of civil society or NGOs in foreign relations, peace, and human rights advocacy. And it really is a mechanism to bring the demands of movements to another level of government, to policy making at the international level. And it's especially valuable, I think, because it's a way to leverage power when governments are not representing the interests of people, and especially when they don't comply with international human rights standards. And it gives a voice to people who are affected by state policies which violate international norms and those standards of human rights. So just, to briefly state the situation, the US government has duties to respect international human rights of both residents and citizens. And it has duties to all members of the UN, in fact, to all members of the international community. And these duties arise from US membership in the UN and its agencies, and from customary international law and treaties, which are the supreme law of the land under our federal constitution, Article 6, the Supremacy Clause. And the key treaties that I'll refer to are the United Nations Charter, the Human Rights Covenants. I'm not going to go into detail on those, but the principles from those and the covenants are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And then there's a key customary law basis of human rights, and that's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which goes back to 1948. So I'm going to be talking about the right to health, but I'm narrowing in on the right to health care. And health care is a component part of the right to health, which is much broader. It's also, healthcare is also a component of the right to an adequate standard of living, which is a separately cognizable right under the Universal Declaration. And then I'd just like to point out that human rights are universal, indivisible, and interdependent, and they are not hierarchical. That is, they are not an unalienable rights commission statement of hierarchies of rights is totally wrong. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that I've been doing and the work of the National Lawyers Guild, and particularly as it's worked on human rights. So at the UN Founding Conference in San Francisco in 1945, the Guild was one of the non-governmental organizations that participated, and it played a really important role with other organizations in advocating for language in the UN Charter, including in the preamble, which actually has language mentioning human rights and equal rights of men and women. Also in Article 68, the Guild advocated for the creation or the authority to create a human rights entity, and that was first the UN Human Rights Commission. It's now called the UN Human Rights Council. And then in Article 71, the charter provides that the Economic and Social Council has a mission to consult with civil society, with non-governmental organizations. So these are really important. This is a really important piece of Lawyers Guild history and UN history. And I think it hasn't really been used very much by the Lawyers Guild, or not to the maximum it could, but it is really a very interesting basis for not just the Lawyers Guild, but for other not-for-profit NGOs who want to be involved in human rights advocacy. So the Guild has also been involved at other stages in its history. For example, in 1995, the Guild was involved with other NGOs in getting the General Assembly to ask the International Court of Justice for an advisory opinion on the legality of nuclear weapons. And then recently, one of the activities of the Guild has been to take a position and work with the anti-war movement in the US and elsewhere against unilateral coercive measures, that is economic sanctions. And we've been doing education and making statements and working in coalitions to especially address this now during the pandemic, since they are having a really terrible impact on healthcare systems and the right to health in other countries. And then what I really want to focus on now is the Universal Periodic Review of the United States by the UN Human Rights Council. So this is coming up on November 9th. We're in the third cycle of reviews. So they take place every 4 years, and each country is reviewed for all of its human rights obligations. There's a lot of treaties. So the idea was to bring the treaty process together so it wouldn't become administratively impossible to do. So my involvement and the Lawyers Guild involvement has been to write a shadow report on healthcare. And that's actually, there is another report that the Guild submitted on voting rights as well. But in any event, what I'm going to talk about is the report I wrote on behalf of the Guild. And that was done also and submitted on behalf of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, the People's Action Institute, and Rights and Democracy Institute. And when I use the word shadow, what it means is it shadows the official US government report, which ironically in this case was submitted after our shadow reports. It was only submitted a few weeks ago, late. So our report is called The Right to Health, How Financing Affects the Right to Health Care in the US. And I just want to mention that, you know, I was motivated to do this in 2019 because it seemed like the issue of single payer and the right to health care was for the first time really part of a campaign and really getting a lot more publicity in the media. And our movements obviously have been, you know, have brought things to this level. So it seemed like it would be helpful to build the movement at another level and to bring some kind of international attention to bear on what the realities are in the United States. So we did the report was filed in 2019 in September, and it was filed with the UN Human Rights Council. And we've worked with the US Human Rights Network, which is a national organization. It's a coalition of groups, and these shadow reports were filed by a number of groups in and outside the network. There were well over 350 organizations filing shadow reports on various issues of human rights. Our report also was filed with two groups that are using a human rights framework. One of them is People's Action, and it was their institute, their foundation that was the submitter along with us, and Rights and Democracy, Vermont and New Hampshire. And a lot of people are aware of Vermont Workers Center, and that's the predecessor of Rights and Democracy. And so I've been working throughout with one of the people who is really involved in the Vermont campaign that really put the idea of healthcare as a human right out there for other groups to use. Also, the Guild has an international affiliate, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, and they joined with us in this report. We have membership of lawyers from about 50 countries. Our office for the IADL is in Geneva, and the IADL has consultative status at the UN, both with with ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, as well as UNESCO. It was effective doing this report in that it was mentioned in the stakeholder report, which the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights compiled of all the reports that were submitted, which obviously was a very abbreviated report considering the volume of our shadow reports. We did get mentioned. In fact, we got #1 footnote for our report, which is great. But the point that they seized on, which I think is interesting, was relative to the problem of income inequality. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Maybe people will want to pursue that, some of those issues. Then the US, as I mentioned, the US government report only came out a few weeks ago. And amazingly, it only had 2 paragraphs on healthcare in the entire report, which were devoted to a short discussion of maternal mortality without mentioning that things had gotten worse between 2017 and 2019. Didn't mention the pandemic at all, amazingly. Although we know for a fact that the Department of State was writing that in July. So pretty amazing. And then right now, what we're doing is our different organizations are lobbying the members of the Human Rights Council in order to prepare for the review on November 9th. So and a few other states who are coming in and out of the council. For example, we've communicated with 22 states, and I have a meeting coming up with a representative from Namibia this week. We are hoping that we will have, I'm pretty sure we'll have some support from, for example, Cuba, who has in the previous cycles consistently asked questions about US healthcare system. And there's a number of other states. So we tried to contact all the states who had expressed interest in healthcare in the United States in the last cycles. So you can see it's fairly, complicated process, a lot of administrative work. And that will be broadcast, that session, with the US being questioned by the members of the council. It will be broadcast, I think it's going to be at 5 a.m., but it is a public will have access to that. So now I want to just talk about what we put in our report. And I might say that from what I have seen of the submissions from the previous cycles, that the issue of the human rights standards for financing never saw the light of day. Apparently, those kinds of issues, the economic side of standards, don't get addressed very much. And I think it's really because we've been in a long phase of extreme neoliberalism, and a lot of issues about commodification of human rights have just not really come to the fore. In any event, these are some of the points that we made, and so I'll just run through them. First of all, that the financing systems are inadequate, inequitable, and unsustainable. So those are all criteria financing systems. We made the point that healthcare financing negatively affects the interdependent right to an adequate standard of living. We also discussed specific violations, which of course this group is very familiar with, such as the lack of universal access, the issues of affordability, the grossly discriminatory and unequal care that we have, and then some issues about the failure to have the highest quality of care, which is part of the human rights standard. And so, of course, we have our care is dependent on the ability of pay. We don't require acceptance of Medicare or Medicaid. It's the reverse of what it should be, which is healthcare as a human right. And then we asked for 2 recommendations, nothing more. We asked that they recommend that the United States have a publicly funded national dialogue on healthcare as a human right and single payer, and that there be a recommendation to support national single payer legislation for healthcare to be provided to all residents as a human right. So I want to just talk a little more specifically about the points we made under the inadequacy criterion. It's a human rights requirement under the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Covenant, as well as articulated in other human rights treaties, and is definitely part of customary law, that a state is required to commit what's called maximum available resources for the right to health. I can talk more about that if people are interested, but we do, obviously, we have 3-point-something trillion committed, but the resources are misallocated. So what we talked about was, there is a large outlay, but the particular funding is not always sufficient. For example, and it reinforces inequality. One thing we mentioned was the lower per capita for Indian Health Service, which is lower than Medicare and Medicaid rates, or the denial of funding for reproductive health care, the unavailability of care for immigrants, insufficient targeting to minority and vulnerable populations who have inferior health outcomes, and the absence of funding for mental health care. Then we looked at issues of equity, and particularly one of those areas that doesn't get enough attention in human rights analysis, but the rapporteurs are all getting more interested in this, the different rapporteurs, not only the healthcare ones, and that is the whole question of taxation and how the system is financed. So here we have, general taxes, but more reliance on income and Social Security. And of course, the income tax is more progressive than Social Security, which has a flat rate that goes into effect on the first dollar. Well, at the same time, the big issues are that the tax revenues from corporate tax have been extremely reduced. There was a 2017 tax cut bill, so the corporate tax went down from 35 to 21%. And then, we don't have other taxes from capital sources. So the burden gets shifted further onto income tax and Social Security, which obviously have equity issues. And then, of course, what this group is very familiar with and we've had a lot of discussion about, the user fees, which of course is a trademark of neoliberalism, the premiums, deductibles, co-payments, and for that matter, inadequate insurance, having to have multiple insurances, have an especial burdensome impact on people in the median to, below the median income quintiles. Then, this whole issue of the financing being sustainable. Obviously, there are big questions about long-term sustainability, but, fundamentally, the idea that the outlays for healthcare have to ensure profits or create profit incentives result in denial of care, and it's just antithetical to the human right to health. Then there's all these issues of privatization, and this group is very familiar with with Medicare Advantage and the recent Mission Act of 2018, which is now, on the road to privatizing veterans care. So those obviously raise costs too. And then a couple of areas which I think are really important and are less discussed in terms of particular rights, but are very directly related to overall health and access, and that is the both income and wealth inequality can be seen across the board, not just in the US, to mark a decline in the standard of living, and that affects negatively universal access, of course. And then with the rising income and wealth inequality, which is, there are various measurements that are pertinent, but we're seeing increased mortality rates of lower income people. The research is pretty shocking and we did mention, the 10-year life expectancy disproportionality between lower and higher income people. In any event, this kind of gets into an interesting and problematic area, which brings in the civil right to life, because under the Treaty on Civil and Political Rights, arbitrary deprivation of life is prohibited. And so we raise this, even though there's not a lot of writing or research on this as applied to healthcare, but really I think it's a good question. If public policy makers know that a policy will cause greater mortality, is this an arbitrary deprivation of life? So I just want to raise some questions and be open to answering, any questions people might have about the report. But I think what I'm really interested in seeing is how we can broaden the kind of work we're doing across borders and more internationally to promote the right to health and change the kind of narrative that's being mostly, occupying the US airwaves. And a couple of things that I'm really interested in talking about or pursuing, with people individually beyond this are just the essence of a human right, the whole notion of the movement towards public and the really examining the distinctions that have been made between public and private and how that has played into our lack of access. All these issues about commodification and financialization, which are also happening in, for example, the right to housing. And there's a lot of issues related to the unequal social relations, which of course have come to the fore so much more with the pandemic and the rise of, billionaires and so forth. Another area that I am really interested in and is, I think, an area that we have to be paying attention to is that there seems to be a parallel development of a movement for Medicaid for all. And this is really, in my view, not the direction to go. The idea that everyone would be subjected to means testing or proving eligibility is really really fits in with the way that healthcare has been commodified and the whole neoliberal approach to healthcare, which is to take healthcare away from being a public good. And I think that, we have to have more discussion about the human right to healthcare as a measure, a way to reach human dignity and to build social bonds that bring us together in a common way. And also, interestingly, which some of the universal basic income people are doing from both left and right, is to talk about equal freedom in making decisions, And this is also true in healthcare, that if people have a right to healthcare, they would be able to make their own decisions about their own health and healthcare in a way that they haven't been able to. So that's basically my slideshow. So I'm open to questions, comments, whatever.
That was great, and lots of things for us to understand, because it's not really complex. The issue of healthcare is a human right, but the details of it in terms of dealing with the UN and international community. But I had a question relating to the report that's going before the UN Human Rights Council. So a couple of years ago, and like what will happen? And the reason I asked that is a few years ago, I believe a report came out from the council. I think it was the council, and you can correct me. And they looked at the issue of reparations in the United States for African Americans. And it was a really very strongly worded report. And I haven't heard anything about it after the initial revelation. And I wondered if you had, and the reason I asked that is because I'm wondering where these, when the council meets and hears your report and the international community weighs in, what can we expect to happen after that?
Well, they won't actually hear our report. What will happen will be that the different members of the missions that are members of the Human Rights Council will have an opportunity to ask questions of the United States. And then they will make recommendations, and those will be written up and given to the United States. And so with respect to the reparations issue particularly, you know, there was a special session recently about the police violence and murder in the United States, which is a special session of the UN Human Rights Council. And reparations was part of the topic, but all of these meetings are very limited, and so it behooves us, you know, the people in these movements, to keep going back to these entities to demand that they actually fulfill the recommendations. And of course, with the recommendations to our specific government, we have to, you know, go to the government as well. So it's a dynamic process, and it just gives us another tool for putting pressure, and also to the extent that the US can be embarrassed in an international forum, it gives us that kind of opportunity. But I don't want to convey that there's like going to be a particular quantifiable result out of this, because really it's a review and the whole process is an ongoing one. With respect to the health care of African Americans and reparations issues, you know, the US actually ratified the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And that treaty is not being used very much to, you know, as part of the demands that organizations are making. So there are opportunities for doing more with that, including the follow-up from this recent special meeting. It was not what the groups in the US hoped for, was to have a mission come from the Human Rights Council to investigate, a mission of inquiry. And instead it was stated that there would be general inquiry into a number of countries. So I think what it does is give us a tool to try to bring more governments to support our social movements, as well as to align us with other civil society groups in other countries. We're still going to obviously have the same problems we have with our government, you know, because so and the fact that and the fact that it's ongoing is good, you know. Like, if for example, Cuba, which is coming back onto the Human Rights Council now in January, if they will ask more questions, it would be great, because they've been very assertive and are not intimidated. But that's another problem, is that's why we're doing all this lobbying, because we have to choose countries that we think will be a little bit independent of US pressure to ask questions. I mean, because that's the way the politics are,
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Hey, that's good.
From a practical standpoint, having appeared before the UN multiple times in a past life, and then working with the State Department, the reality is that our government at present really doesn't care what the UN says about the US.
Yeah.
And even though the report that, I believe it was Betty that asked about it, the reality is that our United States senators pretty much scoff at international treaties. Even though they are the supreme law of the land, they don't act that way.
Right.
So, to me, part of an opportunity would be that activists need to start learning and holding out the UN treaties and saying that this is happening in this country, this country, this country. Why are we allowing this in the United States? And it's almost I don't want to use the word shame, but it's an education and it's a correction of how our Congress and our executive branch behave when it comes to the UN. Because at least my engagement on environmental and toxic issues over, decades, they don't really give a crap.
Yeah.
They really don't care. And so it seems like part of what we have to do is when this comes up is we have to figure out how movements can start incorporating this into their message, don't you think?
Yes, absolutely, because that is, if, for example, just a bunch of lawyers go to the UN Human Rights Council, that is not very effective. But what I like about working with the US Human Rights Network is that these are mass organizations like People's Action Institute, which started as, Midwest Academy in Chicago and has lots of organizations, has thousands and thousands of members, and if in fact organizations in the US begin not only to incorporate human rights framing, but also begin to understand that it's not just slogans, that actually human rights can be measured, and that you can actually, and that we have common measurement across, borders, then we can actually also talk with people elsewhere and get them to help us in, in holding our government accountable. So but it is really, it's a lot, I think, an educational process. It's not like we're going to enforce human rights by going to, and in fact, international law, is supposed to be a consensual system of states agreeing to be bound, and it requires persuasion, it requires hard organizing and persuasion. That's really, the kind of project that this is.
I'd like to ask just a thought right there. We definitely have the impression that the United States considers itself independent of all of this, and that we are already perfect, so why should we pay any attention to anybody else? But when you talk about, we're not the only ones who sort of thumb our noses at the UN. I'm thinking of Russia and China as examples. They do what they damn please, including poisoning people. And the hell with the UN. So we have a ways to go beyond just the US. Any ideas along those lines? What sort of reaction do you get about Russia and China?
Well, because I'm not working on Russia and China, I'm working on the US, which is why I think, that people in Russia and China need to work on their particular countries, as do people in, all the Security Council countries that are, nuclear powers, right? But I think that it gives, what I'm interested in is applying the standards here, domestically, because of American exceptionalism, because it's really been so difficult. And because we could control, presumably, if we, believe we have some kind of democratic form of government, we should be able to control what our own government does with respect to us who live here. So that's really my focus is to make those standards mean something here in the US, because this is a place where we could actually have some influence. And I know many people think of human rights. I mean, it's sort of been presented to the public in the US as human rights applies to other places. And you can see this very much, for example, in the way that human rights programs are set up in academia. I mean, at UW-Bothell, they had a class, it was called Human Rights in the US, as if, the regular human rights class didn't pertain to the US. It was really strange, but I think that is kind of a phenomenon of the exceptionalist way that we've looked at human rights. So I just am really interested in this as a tool for doing our work here. And obviously, when you go to an entity like the Human Rights Council, because it's set up, it has 47 members, and states are selected from different regions, so it has regional diversity. And so you're always going to be asking, if you're a non-governmental organization, you're going to be interacting with other states. So it's kind of a weird kind of citizen diplomacy, because we're just asking really for these other states to ask our government questions, to ask them hard questions about, because really it's a recommendation type of process. It has its limitations for sure, but I do think that the process also of doing the educational work here and with organizations, for example, for us working on healthcare, is to actually clarify what those international standards are, which after all, the US was, one of the main forces in the, US lawyers were involved in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They had a very big role from the Roosevelt administration. So we can hardly say that it was some kind of, plot from another place.
Is there any place in your shadow report for pointing out the deleterious effects of U.S. foreign policy on healthcare as a human right in other countries, such as relate to the sanctions against Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, and blockades preventing medicine from getting in there and trying to interfere with the brigades that Cuba is sending to other countries that need them during the COVID?
We didn't focus on that in 2019, but we have, as the Guild has as an organization, taken a position against unilateral coercive measures. I've been working on that too with, we had a webinar, an international webinar with some people from different countries who are experiencing sanctions and talking about healthcare. And there's a really good report from the Center for Economic and Political Rights, CEPR, on the number of excess deaths in Venezuela as a result of US sanctions, which I think that they concluded it was in 1 year about 40,000 excess deaths due to sanctions. Yeah, so that is something that the Guild is actually, and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, are interested in working more on this problem, which is unilateral coercive sanctions violate the UN Charter. And it's a huge topic. The United States has sanctions against more than 30 countries. I think the group that's doing the most in terms of organizing in the US is the anti-war coalition, like the Seattle Anti-War Coalition. And that organization nationally had a week of action that I participated in the spring, and they're continuing to work on this problem. So they're seeing it as, something less than an invasion or war, but as having the consequences of war. In fact, I think arguably economic sanctions probably cause more deaths than a lot of wars that have been waged anyway. So yeah, and the report that CEPR did on Venezuela was very detailed on the health impacts. They talk about, for example, one of the sanctions against Venezuela was to prevent Colombia from fulfilling a contract with Venezuela for medicines, which they had negotiated several years prior. Just that kind of, obviously that's just one little example, but it's a very serious problem. So in a way, I think it is related to, I see it as another face of our government, that they're willing to cause this kind of denial of health in other countries, and they're doing it to us, by what's happening with the result of the pandemic is just, well, I guess we're now 222,000 dead. That is, we did an addendum also to the report, just a little bit about the pandemic and how it's taken place to make worse the commodified healthcare system that we already have. And we've also, linked the increasing rates of poverty to the denial of health as well. So I don't know I wonder if any questions like that will come up. And then there was a question, we had a briefing on April 15th, the Human Rights Network did, and there were not many questions from the states who attended. There were a number of people from the EU. I think there are 5 from there, and there were about 25, 30 countries, but they were really concerned about the US withdrawal from the World Health Organization, of course. The report and the summary, did you post that, David?
No, but I can do that.
Oh, yeah, because if people would like to see it, it has a lot more detail on, different mortality. We also started off by giving an overall assessment of the lack of any human rights culture, and we talked about the Unalienable Rights Commission and the idea of giving priority to freedom of religion over all other rights, including the right to health, and addressed some of the issues relating to women's health, of course. But and then we also tried to really lay out what PPACA has meant in terms of the commodification of healthcare. And because in fact, when the last review took place, apparently the State Department people were very, breezy in their statements about how everybody's going to have health care and it was just going to be fine. And so there weren't so many questions asked about the entire system. So I think probably the members of the Human Rights Council have a better idea of how employer-based healthcare is a complete failure after this pandemic. But some of them may have questions. They may have a lot of questions. I don't know. We'll see. I hope that we get some good ones on healthcare, though.
Betty again. Yeah, I just had one other thing about, and wanting to know your experience. I really think that one of the very the problematic of Americans understanding that healthcare is a human right is because I don't think we understand that it's a problem to commodify a right. I mean, and I think maybe lots of people, in this session today, and certainly PNHP board members, because we've spoken to a lot of different groups, and over many years, as you have. And I think that the idea, when you say to them that healthcare should not be a commodity, they have never thought about this before.
Yeah, yeah.
It is so foreign that for some reason I'm thinking that that is where we need to go. And I'm wondering what your experience is and what you think about that.
That's such a good question, because just on Monday, I got up really early so I could listen to this webinar, which 7 UN rapporteurs had put together to talk about privatization. And for the first time, and there was an article that they wrote collectively that was published in The Guardian also on Monday about how privatization of healthcare and other human rights is a disaster, has to be resisted, that the entire commodification of public good is a big mistake. And it's the first time that a number of people, like, legal experts like this, have come together to make this strong a statement. It's interesting because similar statements have been coming from other parts of the UN system. There was actually there's a goal that the World Health Organization has to make universal health care, by 2030. That's only 10 years away. They had also, the Secretary General a couple years ago talked about how important a universal single payer system was, so of the General Assembly, so of the UN. So it's interesting because this is now, what the whole issue of commodification, because of the pandemic and the need to collaborate across borders to actually deal with the kinds of health challenges that we have, is really making, in addition to the huge rise in inequality and just like, all the billionaires who doubled their assets in the last few months. I mean, I think people are that there is a lot more desire to start talking about this, but it's very slow. I mean, we've been in this, neoliberal place actually since 1980s, but actually even before that, the ideology was being, shopped around. And certainly you could say that the coup in Chile was, a test for commodifying just about everything, and they did, but it didn't work, and now that, the misery is so great and we have a rise in social movements, I do see hope, that people would be open, to seeing how important it is to have strong government, to have public goods, and that you can't solve climate change by the market. It's absurd. I mean, there's a lot of issues now that are so much in the public eye that I think that, the timing it's much better. But I do agree that it's a huge educational thing. Like even the issue of means testing, I've just really been, how difficult it is to have those conversations. I think it goes along the line of, charity is fine, that charity that means that people who are well off are good, and there's not really much discussion about who gets to make decisions and whether people have autonomy, and whether they have rights that give them dignity. Those questions have not really, you know, been adequately discussed. But I do think that the time is, you know, if it's not here, it's coming. And there also, I've been in touch with people working on universal basic income, and it's really interesting how much that idea, like the European Union is having this, I think it's a referendum, or maybe it's an initiative. They're trying to have a EU initiative on universal basic income, unconditional income. That is really an amazing thing. That's 30 countries. I mean, it's pretty amazing that they're looking at the future and at, you know, the need for people to have income security to be able to live. I think that, you know, the pandemic has, I mean, this is like the positive things of being in a pandemic, I guess.
Well, I think Trump has helped to organize us too, because look at all the new young legislators that are being elected and are likely to be elected 2 weeks from today.
Yeah.
Like the squad and people like that look like they're going to turn out some corporate Democrats and take over some Republican seats.
Yeah, it would be nice.
Martha, I thought that was great. I think the main thrust of it to me would be educational.
Mm-hmm.
As really what we're relying on now is public opinion and grassroots movements to try and shift our politicians to a more reality-based situation that has more to do with people than with corporations and their profits.
Yeah.
And, you know, obviously in many of our minds, we were once again forced to swallow a corporate Democrat as our presidential candidate.
Mm-hmm.
But the hope is that we will, once, God willing, once they get in power, that the will of the people hopefully will be able to shift their agenda. Because I think, and I've not seen it, and if anybody knows any data about what the current estimated cost of the pandemic is right now. I saw one article because I was very curious about what Trump's 3-day hospitalization cost, and it was $650,000. That's including his helicopter transport. But it's not, obviously the misery of the deaths are horrific.
Yeah.
But, being a trauma surgeon, I can tell you, you don't lose money on dead people because they're gone. It's the people that cost the system are the people who linger with ICU care, prolonged illnesses, and then complications. I was talking to the chief of trauma at Harborview today, Eileen Bolger, and she's currently managing the ECMO service, which is putting people on bypass when their lung failure is so bad that they cannot be adequately managed by traditional, typical mechanical ventilation. So basically you put them, you cannulate them, put them on a bypass pump, and then you just let their lungs rest. But the COVID patients, I think she had 4 ECMO patients, 2 of them which are COVID patients, and the COVID patients take at least a month to recover. That's a month on bypass. And if you think of the cost,
Fantastic. Yeah.
they'll even admit how much that costs. It's almost like these recombinant antibodies. So I think this is great information. I think it's, you know, a death of 1,000 tiny cuts, but this is a movement of thousands of bits of irrefutable information.
Mm-hmm.
And I think groups like ours and other healthcare reform groups need to continue to pressure and educate the public. And this is great cannon fodder to do that.
Yep.
Speaking of which, the U.S. Supreme Court just struck down and sided with the Republican Alabama Secretary of State that you cannot do curbside ballot drops if you're disabled.
Oh,
Just so you know how much of this is at risk this election, folks. And with the Supreme Court appointment pending next week, people don't even know what's going to happen. Common sense is gone.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's going to be here for at least 50 years.
We're gonna have I think we're gonna have a big uprising before then myself, but
I don't think so. I think Americans are pretty.
intend to do what I can. I hope Sarah Nelson gets elected to be the head of the AFL-CIO. That would be really great. Yeah.
Woman, and we need
She's aiming for a general strike in January. I don't know. Whatever.
Yeah, if those of you maybe, Greg Palast, who's an investigative reporter, has got a great new little book on how Trump did 2020.
Yep.
And it's amazing. I mean, just, and I haven't been, I stopped watching network news. I watch PBS. That's about as far as I'll go anymore. But PBS is, you know, more neutral than anybody else. But I wonder if the major networks are covering these long lines and all the really the huge dimension of this voter suppression that occurs, mostly in red southern states, and Ohio and Michigan.
It's pretty good in the Rust Belt in the Midwest where I used to live. Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio are pretty bad right now.
Well, even in Wisconsin, though, I had a report from friends. They set up a system for people to take their ballots to centers, you know, and so I don't know, that was a few weeks ago, but yeah, the 11-hour wait in the line. But, you know, it is true what Margaret Flowers wrote, if not that long ago, about the long time suppression of voting in this country. Because I remember until the 60s, we had poll taxes. You know, it's clear that poor people were not supposed to vote. And we had poll taxes. I guess probably most of the New England states had those. But I remember I had a little part-time job to go do an inventory of people in my town who owed the poll tax. And the few times people slammed the door in my face, I was young, so I didn't really know what was going on. And it was before the Supreme Court decision. But that lasted for a long time. And of course, that was nothing compared to all the other mechanisms, literacy, you know, being able to read this or that, and all the other denials that had gone on in Black voters for, you know, since it's so extreme now. But we have a long bad history of voter suppression, in fact, sometimes more subtle.
Anything except a white male, we do.
A white male property holder was the ideal.
White male landowner, although they really aren't the owner because they stole it from indigenous peoples.
Right.
Deed holder, I guess.
But yeah, well, it is interesting because I've been in the Lawyers Guild sends election observers around. And in fact, Jean Meyer was working with Greg Palast on some of the challenges, and she also did a report for the UN Human Rights Council on voter suppression that was filed too. So we'll see whether they ask any questions of the US on that. I hope so. I just feel like at this juncture, though, we should be, and especially since a lot of, you know, now you could see that states are predicting that there's a lot of things going on, like, you know, people are talking about in other countries, and like the Tri-National Institute, they're talking about getting, you know, de-dollarization. They're talking about, you know, resuscitating the group of 77 and new coalitions. I mean, the US is actually in decline. It's something that we have to recognize. And so the things that we've accepted, you know, as truth, like the US can never be embarrassed or won't try to please any other countries, will always be doing its own thing. You know, I actually think any of this can change because of the way the conditions are developing, and the fact is that China is the biggest economy, you know, so, or is a challenge now to the United States. So, I don't know, but we're going to be working 24/7, I guess, to. Anyway, I hope you get a chance to read the report and also the summary, because I think that the idea of linking the right to health and the right to health care with an adequate standard of living is really important to bring us together with people working on rights to housing, clean water and sanitation, and to the whole idea of notion of income security. And we're really looking at, you know, a lot of jobs having been lost permanently, and you know, the acceleration of replacement of human work with artificial intelligence, which is going to cause even more disruption. You know, and you have like World Economic Forum and, you know, big players like that predicting that the impact also would be more on women, you know, and it's just like people are not dealing with these realities in terms of movement building. But I really do think that our work, you know, for healthcare as a right is, you know, is widely supported and really interconnected with a lot of the other activism that is, you know, ongoing right now. So we have a chance to build some really powerful alliances.
Marty, I'm doing a shame plug, and I put the article I co-wrote into the chat that linked housing, healthcare, income, and food, and how interconnected they are. I put that in the chat, and that got sent to the G7 when we still thought the G7 was going to meet, but they did not meet this year.
Well, it just occurs to me that we have a lot to learn in terms of we're all in this together. Because as you talk about this, I realize we're all on the planet together, and it is going to hell in a handcar too. And trying to get 7 billion pairs of feet pointed in the same direction in order to do something meaningful about changing utilization of resources and creating waste in the air and in the oceans. This is when I'm glad I just had my 80th birthday. I'm not going to be around to see this, but it's very discouraging. But we've certainly, not only in our country, but recognizing that in the whole world, that we are all in it together. And the pandemic is an illustration of that. If melting glaciers doesn't quite hit you in the face, a mask will.
Bezos and Bill Gates both live here, and Amazon doesn't provide its employees health care, and there's lots of opportunities right in our own backyard to try to make a difference.
True.
And use the billionaires that are benefiting to perhaps do some systemic change. And I'm dead serious. Because if we can't do it in our own backyard, I don't know how we can look at other countries.
No, I agree. I really think that the idea that human rights was for other places and not us, you know, is something that we're still, you know, we're just still grappling with. I mean, a lot of people get it, but it's amazing how hard that seems to be to take in.
We've made the almighty dollar more important than life.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It's a value judgment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is ultimately, which is why I think, you know, that it's getting at this issue of how do we build a different narrative, because it has, well, we had George Lakey was good on that, wasn't he, David? When he did his workshop or with the PNHP Western Washington, that was great. But we don't always implement things we learn from from people who have some insight. But, and it's hard because we don't, the media, I think people are hoping the established media is going to turn around. I don't think that's the way we're going to be reaching people, really.
It was interesting when the Seattle Times endorsed Pramila. They said, look at all these things she's done. She's a leader and blah, blah, blah. They didn't mention her most important thing,
healthcare.
1384, which is the Medicare for All bill. That wasn't even in the editorial endorsement.
Well, they're hoping it'll go away, probably.
I think so.
Yeah, out of sight, out of mind.
As we
I bet they
stand
didn't
as a
mention
group,
housing as a human right either. She introduced some legislation that on housing too. Oh, go ahead, Hugh.
well, in terms of housing and healthcare and not meeting the basic needs of people, as we stand with our Medicare for All and vote banners over the Esler overpass, which a group of us do every Tuesday morning, in the shadow of homeless tents above the wall.
Yep.
And Harborview Medical Center and the Yesler Terrace development, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then as I drive home on Jackson Street to 23rd and Jackson, where that whole block was developed by Vulcan with the promise that they will tear down the Red Apple Market, which was an important resource for people's food. But still the building is now finished, but there's no sight of a grocery store. So I would agree that there is a lot of work that we can do locally to hold our politicians accountable. And I think as you look around the world, people are starting to rise up everywhere at it. You just go down the list: Chile, Colombia, France, you name it. So
Bolivia,
yeah.
Nigeria.
Yeah.
The Bolivian elections, yippee.
Yay.
So has everybody on this call seen the letter that the Seattle Human Rights Commission wrote, a 5-page letter about why Mayor Durkin should resign and all the human rights violations that have occurred in the city of Seattle?
No, send that to us, please. Karen.
That's a pretty real letter to read, and it's been post George Floyd's horrific matter in my old hometown of Minneapolis. So it's quite interesting. It's been interesting watching the Seattle Times discredit the commission by saying, oh, they're just a bunch of volunteers. I mean, you got to send your resume in for any one of those appointments. You got to be vetted. You got to go through all this. And all of a sudden, the Seattle Times calls them just a bunch of volunteers. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So that's human rights here at the local level, right in Seattle.
Using human rights as an accountability standard is really important because it sets a higher standard than what people have often asked for. And this is really important, I think, to think about how to present this to people, because instead of asking for vague or making less defined demands, you could actually have more measurable goals. And really, I'm just, using it with healthcare, but it's true for housing and for other areas where we're, really trying to get some kind of accountability, like Karen just said with the mayor's the attempt to get her to resign is of course related to her total mishandling of policing and more. But I think that is one of the beauties of trying to use a human rights framing. It's not to say that it's easy, but it would be more effective than a lot of the ways that we're working. Anyway, that's why I do it.
I'm grateful you're doing it, and I'm grateful you let me come hear you speak in front of the group.
Also, if you're not on our PNHP email, pnhp.westernwashington@comcast.net, and I'll put you on our list, because you'll need to be on it to get your instructions on the next step in the revolution.
Right. Good. I'm glad you're going to be taking on that responsibility, David. Nice seeing everybody.
Yeah, thanks, Marty.
Likewise, thanks a lot,
Thank
Marty.
you.
I'm muted because my husband is on the phone.
Bye.